On the night of September 8, 1900, as the deadliest hurricane in American history swallowed the shores of Galveston, a single lighthouse still burned against the wind. Inside that tower stood a woman who had already lost everything, and she made a decision that would save hundreds, but cost her more than anyone would ever know. This is not a story about the storm. It is a story about the light that refused to go dark. In 1875, along the quiet Gulf Coast near Galveston, a girl named Eleanor Wright grew up inside the rhythm of waves. Her father, Samuel Wright, was assistant keeper of a coastal beacon that guided merchant ships into port. The sea was not gentle, but it was honest. Eleanor learned early that light meant survival. Every evening at dusk, her father would climb the spiral stairs and ignite the lamp. "Ships trust what they cannot see," he once told her. "They trust the light." By the time Eleanor turned 16, she could clean the lens, trim the wick, and calculate tide charts better than most trained men. But in 1893, fever took her father in less than a week, and the lighthouse almost went dark. The authorities in Galveston did not believe a woman should manage a coastal beacon alone. They told her it was dangerous. They told her it was improper. They told her she would fail. Eleanor did not argue. She simply lit the lamp that evening, and the next, and the next. After months of letters and persistence, she was officially appointed temporary keeper. Temporary. But ships did not care about politics. They cared about light. By 1900, Galveston was booming. It was called the Wall Street of the South. Cotton exports, railroads, grand homes along the seawall. No one believed disaster could reach them. Even when warnings of a tropical storm spread through the Gulf, city leaders hesitated. Storms were common. The sea had always pulled back before. But Eleanor felt something different in the air. The tide charts did not make sense. The wind carried a strange heaviness, and the gulls flew inland. By noon, waves were already flooding the lower streets of Galveston. Families rushed toward higher ground, but the lighthouse stood exposed. Eleanor secured the windows, reinforced the door, and climbed the stairs. She could see rooftops disappearing beneath gray water. Wind howled like a living thing. At 6 p.m., the glass cracked. At 7 p.m., the outer railing tore away. At 8 p.m., the Gulf swallowed the first row of houses, but the lamp still burned. Shortly after nightfall, she saw them. A small boat, nearly overturned, fighting the surge. Inside were 5 figures: 2 children, a mother, an elderly man, and someone rowing desperately. They were drifting toward the rocks. Eleanor had a choice: stay inside and protect the beacon, or leave the light unattended to save strangers. If the lamp went out, ships offshore could crash. If she stayed, the family would die. The wind screamed against the tower. The light flickered. Eleanor wrapped a rope around her waist and stepped into the storm. For 8 minutes, the beacon stood unguarded. Wind shook the structure violently. Rain extinguished the flame. For the first time in 25 years, the lighthouse went dark. But below, in the roaring floodwaters, Eleanor reached the boat. She tied the rope, pulled, dragged them toward the tower's base. One by one, she secured them inside. When she climbed back up the stairs, shaking and bleeding from broken glass, she found the worst had happened. The lamp was out. Ships offshore had no guide. She relit it with hands that would not stop trembling, and the beam cut through darkness once more. By morning, over 6,000 people were dead in what history now calls the Great Galveston Hurricane. Entire neighborhoods erased. families gone. But maritime records later confirmed something astonishing. 3 cargo ships reported seeing the lighthouse beam reappear shortly after 10 p.m. All 3 altered course. All 3 survived. Over 200 sailors lived because the light returned. The city rebuilt. Engineers raised Galveston's elevation. They constructed a seawall. They modernized warnings. But Eleanor's name rarely appeared in headlines. She never married. She never left the coast. She simply continued lighting the lamp. When asked years later why she left the beacon unattended, she answered, "Because sometimes the light is not the flame. Sometimes the light is the choice." America remembers presidents, generals, inventors. But it was also built by quiet guardians, by people who stood alone in towers, by women who defied expectation, by those who chose humanity over safety. And on one violent night in 1900, when the sea tried to erase a city, one woman refused to let the light go dark. September 8th, 1900, late afternoon, Galveston. There is a sound the ocean makes before it decides to destroy something. It is not thunder. It is not wind. It is something deeper, like a door closing somewhere beneath the world. Eleanor Wright heard it from the lantern room long before the first wall of water reached the streets. The Gulf had turned the color of iron. The horizon had disappeared. Below her, the city that called itself the Wall Street of the South was still trying to pretend everything would be fine. Men nailed boards over windows, women gathered linens, children stared at the strange, endless water creeping over the wharf. But Eleanor saw what others could not. The barometer inside the tower had dropped lower than she had ever seen, lower than her father had ever recorded, and she remembered something he once told her. "When the pressure falls that fast, Ellie, the sea isn't visiting. It's coming to stay." In 1900, Galveston was the richest city in Texas. Grand Victorian homes lined Broadway. Streetcars clattered through busy avenues. Cotton ships filled the harbor. Newspapers dismissed warnings from Cuban meteorologists. The U.S. Weather Bureau had downplayed the storm. Storms curved north. Storms weakened. Storms did not erase cities. By 3 p.m., water was knee-deep downtown. By 5 p.m., horses were drowning in their stalls. By 6 p.m., entire houses were lifting from their foundations. And still, the lighthouse stood alone against the wind. Inside the tower, Eleanor moved with mechanical calm. Trim the wick, polish the lens, secure the hatch. Wind slammed against the glass panes of the lantern room with a force that made the metal frame scream. She could see debris already moving in the surf, roof shingles, planks, entire doors. At 6:43 p.m., the first body floated past. A man, face down. The storm had not yet reached full strength. The hurricane made landfall just after 8 p.m. Winds estimated later at over 135 miles per hour. But that number would mean nothing to the people inside the storm, because wind at that speed doesn't feel like air. It feels like walls hitting you over and over again. The lighthouse shuddered. A piece of roof, torn from some distant home, struck the outer railing and exploded into splinters. Glass cracked. Water forced itself through the seams. Eleanor tied rope around the interior supports to brace herself when climbing the spiral steps. Every few minutes she checked the flame. Still burning. Still alive. At approximately 9:12 p.m., through sheets of rain, Eleanor saw something impossible. Movement against the tide. A small wooden skiff. It was not sailing. It was being thrown. Inside were 5 silhouettes, A woman clutching two children, an elderly man barely conscious, and a young man rowing against a sea that had no mercy. They were heading toward the rock line east of the tower. If they struck it, the boat would splinter, and in that water, survival would last seconds. The light flickered again, the wind roared, and Eleanor faced a decision that history would never properly record. She wrapped rope around her waist and anchored it to the iron rung at the base of the lantern stair. She looked once more at the flame. If it went out, ships beyond the harbor could be lost, but if she did nothing, the boat would be lost for certain. She descended. The tower door burst open the moment she released the latch. Water slammed into her chest. The rope snapped tight. The wind nearly lifted her from her feet. Step by step, she moved toward the surf. The boat hit a swell and overturned. Children screamed, the sound lost instantly in the storm. Eleanor dove. Salt water filled her mouth. She grabbed fabric, a sleeve, and pulled. The rope strained. She tied one child to her line, then the other. The mother fought panic as Eleanor shouted instructions no one could hear. Behind her, inside the lantern room, rain blew sideways through cracked glass, and at 9:20 p.m., the flame died. For 8 minutes, the Lighthouse of Galveston stood in total darkness. When Eleanor dragged the last survivor inside the tower's base, she could barely feel her hands. The elderly man was unconscious. The young rower's arm bent unnaturally, broken. The children would not stop shaking. "Stay here," she told them, though her voice was barely more than breath. She climbed, each step heavier than the last. At the top, she found the lantern room flooded with rain and shards of glass. The wick was soaked. Her matches were damp. Her hands would not stop trembling. Outside, ships were somewhere beyond the black horizon. Without the beam, they were blind. She struck a match. It failed. Another. Nothing. She pressed the box inside her shirt for warmth, shielding it from the wind. One final match remained. She struck it against the metal brace. It flared. She cupped it like it was a newborn child, touched it to the wick. For one eternal second, nothing happened. Then the oil caught. The flame grew. The Fresnel lens magnified it into a blade of white fire. At 9:28 p.m., the light returned. Far offshore, 3 cargo ships altered course. When dawn finally broke on September 9th, 1900, there was no city left to greet it. Galveston had been flattened. An estimated 6,000 to 8,000 people were dead, the deadliest natural disaster in American history. Homes reduced to piles of lumber, families erased in a single night. The rescued family from the boat would later tell officials, "If not for the lighthouse woman, we would have been taken." But Eleanor never gave testimony. She returned to cleaning the lens. Mass graves were dug along the shoreline. When they filled, bodies were sent back to sea. When the sea returned them, the smell of death settled over everything. Eleanor helped tend to the wounded. She never spoke of the darkness, never spoke of the match, never spoke of fear. But at night, when wind brushed the tower softly, she sometimes woke believing it had returned. Maritime records from September 1900 confirm 3 vessels, the Clara Barton, the Gulf Trader, and the Marie Celeste II, reported losing sight of the Galveston beacon around 9:20 p.m. At 9:28 p.m., the beam reappeared. Each captain changed heading. Each survived the storm offshore. Over 200 sailors lived. None of them ever knew her name. In the years that followed, engineers undertook one of the most ambitious civil projects in American history. They raised the elevation of the entire city. They built the massive Galveston seawall. Houses were jacked up and filled underneath with sand pumped from the Gulf.
Galveston literally lifted itself from tragedy. And through it all, the lighthouse remained. So did Eleanor. History remembers the storm. It remembers numbers. It remembers destruction. But it rarely remembers the hands that relit the flame. In a tower above a drowning city, one woman chose humanity over protocol. And because of that choice, the light refused to go dark.